Good afternoon, Suburban readers, Suburban viewers. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Pages. My great pleasure to have with me today Arsen Ostrovsky. He's the CEO of the International Legal Forum from Israel. He's just back from The Hague, observing what Bret Stephens in the Wall Street Journal. I'm sorry, Bret Stephens has now switched to the New York Times. He's a friend of mine. I should have remembered that. Has called the first show trial of the 21st century. Thank you for being in Montreal. Thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Arsen, what were your impressions first of why Israel decided to even defend itself, even recognize the importance of this? Because Israel, of course, has been threatened with calls about genocides in this century since Ariel Sharon. Why now? Why did they decide to make this full-out effort?
The charges were so preposterous, so egregious, so utterly baseless, which, in essence, an obscene and unconscionable and immoral perversion of justice that Israel could not just stand by. It had to have its voice heard on an international platform. It could not allow South Africa to have and control the narrative. So I think the Jewish state decided, first of all, in terms of its moral obligations, in terms of its, the need to express its position. I think they felt the need to be there, but also ultimately under its obligations, under the Genocide Convention itself, there was the need to come to speak, present its arguments, and to dismiss South Africa's baseless and mendacious allegations.
And to those of you who are looking and can look at the presentations both of South Africa and of Israel, when Arsen talks about preposterous, they quote Israeli statements from Israeli entertainers as being proof of some kind of intent, which of course is the bar for a judgment of genocide, which was actually invented. The word was invented here in Montreal by Raphael Lemkin, who himself had run from the Nazis at McGill Law School, and his definition accepted by the UN was quite clear. The specific targeting of a civilian population on an industrial level, and that word is in the definition, for extermination, which of course is not what's happening. But it has, when we talk about how preposterous the South African case is, we've had many countries who have voiced condemnation of the South African claim. Some countries have called it baseless, and it's been quite a coalition of the morally willing in Western Europe, from Germany to Italy to France to the Czech Republic or Czechia, the Netherlands, the UK, the US. Does the very fact that the venality of hate, the venality of anti-Semitism is exposed, do you feel that somehow that actually creates an alliance of some degree of morality? And I hate to be too optimistic in using that word. Are you feeling any of that in Western Europe?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and I think it makes a big difference when you look at, if you do like a split screen, and you look at the countries that have come out to condemn these proceedings, to condemn the politicization of the court, to condemn the subversion of international law and the perversion of the very meaning of the term genocide against Israel, and the subversion of the ICJ itself. You look at those countries that have come out to condemn this. It's, as you said, US, Germany, Austria, specifically those two countries, incredibly important because they know very well what genocide is. They know very well their obligations and history. And then you look at those countries and those entities that have come out to support South Africa's case, and it's Hamas who came out immediately to express their appreciation. You look at Iran. These are the first two entities.
The great civil human rights champion, who's, I believe, are now head of the Women's Council, the Women's Rights Council.
One of the UN agencies, one of the UN committees. Turkey has come out to support the case. Turkey under Erdogan, not exactly the world's greatest bastion of freedom and democracy, who, by the way, continue to provide to this day a safe haven for Hamas. Essentially, it's all these countries that are ultimately supporters of Hamas that have come out to express their support for the case, which is not, which it's a sense of irony, perhaps, but at the end of the day, the reason they've also come out to support South Africa's case is because ultimately what South Africa is doing is they are willingly acting as lead counsel for Hamas in these proceedings. They're acting essentially for Hamas.
As not only a student, but as a participant in the international legal system, if we could, that phrase is still not oxymoronic. Do you gain some, not just hope, but do you gain some satisfaction from the fact that after so many years where the UN, particularly international organizations generally, have been controlled by tyrannies, vastly controlled by tyrannies, 2/3 of the membership of the UN are tyrannies, and when you see Western Europe, which has been criticized in the past for being neutral, and you see Austria making statements like from the river to the sea, criminal, and actually prosecuting, and Germany demanding as an oath of citizenship that there be a recognition of the state of Israel, France engaging in what President Macron has called ruthless deportations, pulling visas from temporary status holders if they participate in these demonstrations. Do you gain some hopefulness that Western Europe is finally waking up to its own existential threat from radical Islam?
I think they're certainly beginning to wake up from the slumber. I don't know if they're fully awoken. They are certainly, I think, becoming much more attuned to the dangers. And I think, and I believe that one of the reasons you are seeing so many Western democracies speaking out against this very case is because they know that the precedent this court will set, if it makes an adverse finding against Israel in any way positively consider South Africa's case, I believe they're also beginning to understand the precedent that will set and the way it will tie their own hands in the fight against terror, in the fight against these jihadist groups.
Now, should any of you, by the way, think that the International Criminal Court of Justice, which is a UN body, is above politics, it's not. There are 15 judges. Each of the parties have a right to name their own judge. Israel has named a former Supreme Court Chief Justice as their judge on the 15, but roughly a third to half of the judges come from countries that are, let us just say, no administration that we would like to live under. And there is one tricky part in their decision-making. And Arsen, could you explain the two-part decision-making of the court? The first part that can come rather quickly, and the second part, the decision on the genocide itself, that could take years.
So essentially what's at stake here is that the court is being asked to rule on the preliminary measure. In other words, South Africa has said that because Israel is committing genocide...
Sorry, this preliminary measure, is that like injunctive relief?
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Correct. So they've said because there is a plausible danger and risk that Israel is committing genocide, therefore they're seeking a set of urgent injunctive reliefs. That includes, and they've really sought everything, that includes a call for a ceasefire, the way combat operations are conducted, the provision of humanitarian aid, the opening of further safe passage corridors, and so on and so forth. So at this particular point in time, the court is being asked to determine if there's even any plausibility in the charges against Israel. Now, they're not determining on substance whether there is. If that does go to substance, that is a process that will take many years. But it first has to get to the stage of, is there plausibility? Because in order to prove substance, I think as you alluded to in the beginning, they also need to prove an element of intent. And the intent is really the key word here.
So it would be like the criminal standard of mens rea.
Yes, exactly that. So the bar, the standard for proving intent is exceptionally high. And it is very, very difficult to prove in these circumstances. And not only very difficult to prove, but the evidence simply does not exist that Israel is committing genocide, which it is not. But the bar, in order to obtain preliminary measures or injunctive relief, is very low because they only have to show some element of plausibility. And I think that is...
Whereas the bar for genocide is very high.
Is tremendously high, yes.
Let's assume for a moment to play out a scenario where they get step one, where the South Africans get step one. Is there any role to play for all the Western democracies that have come out in support of Israel? Because the court itself has no authority to enforce anything.
Correct. I mean, look, the court's decisions are binding and they're not appealable. The courts, the challenge they face is how to enforce their decisions. In terms of other countries stepping up, yes, that is possible. So in addition, you've already had a number of democracies, as we've mentioned, who have come out to condemn these baseless and politicized proceedings. Germany has already gone one step further and said that in addition, that should this case proceed to a hearing on substance, on merit, then Germany will formally become a party to the proceedings in support of Israel.
That's rather extraordinary.
That is, and by the way, even more extraordinary and powerful is the fact that Germany made this announcement within basically 1 hour of the conclusion of the hearings and after Israel's presentation. And it's incredibly powerful and symbolic, and I believe that if this case should proceed to a hearing on substance, you will find other countries, including those that have already come out to condemn the very proceedings themselves, become a formal party.
Can you share with our viewers some of the absurdities of the South African arguments? I've heard much of the pleadings, but there are some things that are just almost comical.
Oh, it's, they would be comical if we weren't talking about something as right. Egregious and heinous and serious as the crime of genocide. They have pointed to the fact that because of the large number of civilian casualties, therefore Israel is intentionally trying to kill Palestinians. That, of course, is entirely not the case. First of all, remember also how many of these casualties are Hamas terrorists themselves. You look at, for example, the proportion of terrorists to civilians killed in terms of the average, in terms of the proportion here, which is in this case is minuscule. So where Israel is,
Israel, as a matter of fact, in most of the engagements that Israel has been involved in, the proportion of enemy combatants versus civilians range roughly 1.5 to 1. Just as a point of comparison, I believe America and Iraq, they killed 4 civilians for every 1 combatant, and I think Britain and America in the Balkans was 7 to 1. Even Canada, in its mission in Kandahar in Afghanistan, with America, was 3 to 1.
Yeah, absolutely. And what this negates, and what was so glaringly missing, I think about the issue with South Africa's case. It's not only what they said, but it's what they glaringly omitted from their pleadings. When they talk about the number of casualties, just because there's a higher number of casualties doesn't mean that there is the commission of genocide. What they omitted to say was, and as we know, is that whereas Israel takes every single effort, goes to extraordinary lengths to avoid and minimize civilian casualties, we know for a fact that it is the Hamas that use their own people as human shields. We know that it is Hamas that embeds their terrorist operations in hospitals. We know that they use homes and schools and mosques as weapon storage depots. We know that, notwithstanding, Israel still abides by the principles of humanitarian law, of proportionality and distinction in order to minimize these casualties. We know that Israel goes to extraordinary efforts to give warnings to Palestinians, which no other army, not the US, not the UK, not Canada, has ever gone to these kinds of lengths to inform in advance what they're going to do. We know they provide safe passage. We know that millions of phone calls and leaflets have gone out. This is the very opposite, in fact, of genocide. And then, the other big part of South Africa's case was the reference to various statements by Israelis with respect to genocidal intentions. Well, as they said, some of these were politicians, and then, the absurdities, some of those were even pop singers. Like pop singers, they try to use that as some kind of evidence of genocidal intent. It's, utterly absurd. But the important thing here is, and as Israel made the case, is that none of those people whom the South Africans quoted are in any position of power or influence in terms of setting the objectives and goals of the war. That belongs to the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the Army Chief of Staff, as well as the War Cabinet. They're the ones that set policy, objectives, and execution of combat operations, and they're being very, very clear that those goals and objectives are very simple: the elimination of the terrorist group Hamas and the rescue of hostages. So as much as some of the statements by other, whether members of Knesset or other persons might be condemnable, and as in many cases they have been condemned, those individuals do not play any kind of role, power, or have any kind of say, influence in terms of setting the military objectives.
This whole situation reminds one of Winston Churchill's great line where he said, a lie goes halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And sadly, we all have a responsibility to maintain vigilance and be intelligent and have intellectual rigor and not be fooled by headlines.
I'll give you one more Churchill quote. You know, one of my favorite quotes of his, when he became Prime Minister, his first speech in the House of Commons, I think it was 1940, he was asked, if you remember, what is your aim? The victory speech. And he said, I can answer that in one word, victory. Victory at all costs, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival.
And victory in spite of all terror was the third line.
Correct, you are correct, yeah.
Arsen Ostrovsky, it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much.
CEO of Israeli Human Rights NGO International Legal Forum. Thank you for being with us. Watch for the story in the hard copy of the paper as well.